Okay, why am I underwater? It's simple. Everything you've been told about global warming and climate change is wrong. Oh, global warming is real, and the climate is changing. But the things you've been told probably aren't right. For instance, you probably think that trees sequester carbon. And the fact of the matter is they don't. Forests don't sequester carbon, and rainforests do not sequester carbon. If you go to a rainforest that's been there for 100, maybe 1,000 years, and you dig up a meter of the soil under that rainforest, and you dig down as far as you like, you won't find the huge tonnage of carbon that you were told that rainforest sequestered. And that's because it didn't sequester the carbon at all. The carbon fell to the ground, rotted, and turned back into CO2. And they're relying on the idea that somehow some portion of that carbon didn't turn back into CO2, and that's how carbon got sequestered. Well, the Earth's atmosphere used to be very high in CO2. And all that CO2 would mount to gigatons of carbon. And that carbon would be under the ground if that's the way carbon was sequestered. And there was a time before the advent of the microbes that ate organic carbon and turned it back into CO2. We call this the Carbonaceous period. And during that time, the carbon did stay in the organic carbon did stay in the ground. But that's not the time we live in now. In the time that we live in, the carbon does not stay in the ground. You're probably saying, well, every year we put out a huge amount of CO2 and a bunch of CO2 is removed from the atmosphere. Unfortunately, not as much as is released, so there's an increasing level of CO2 in the atmosphere. But where is that CO2 going that is being sequestered, that is being removed out of the atmosphere? It explains simply, some of it's being temporarily stored and it's going right back to the atmosphere, so you don't even bother count that. And some of it is being permanently sequestered. A small amount of that might happen in a rainforest when there's a forest fire. You go, oh, but they say all that CO2 is going into the atmosphere. Well, all that CO2 that goes in the atmosphere when a rainforest burns is every bit of it, CO2 that was going to rot and go back to the atmosphere anyways. So the forest fire, all the forest fires change is now the forest is no longer pulling in more CO2, but even that CO2 that is converted to organic carbon in the forest would rot and go back into the atmosphere. But the one time when a rainforest or any forest actually sequesters some carbon is when there's a forest fire, because a layer of charcoal, of pure charred carbon that is not biologically available, not easily consumed, does get buried. And so if you dig down below a rainforest, you'll find carbon wherever that rainforest had a forest fire in the past. So now you're going, wait a second, if you can't show me the carbon, okay, then where is the carbon going, and what carbon is sequestered? Where does that carbon end up? Well, put simply, the carbon that is sequestered, pretty close to all the carbon on Earth that is sequestered in the ocean. Okay? All of it. There is no carbon to any significant amount being sequestered anywhere other than by the ocean. And this process is a vastly complex biological process by which carbon, organic carbon, in the ocean gets eaten and consumed and turned into carbonates. So it does, in a sense, undergo some oxidization. It is burned in a way, but it's turned into carbonates that become mineralized through the natural processes of the ocean. Okay? And that is the only place right now where carbon is being long-term permanently sequestered. You don't believe me? Take a look. 6,000 feet deep below the Bahamas Great Bank. One gigantic hunk of carbonate. 9,000 square miles, 6,000 feet deep, huge slab of carbonate. And one of the most common components that makes up the surface of Earth is, in fact, carbonate, which was at one time CO2 in the atmosphere, that has been sequestered through mineralization in the ocean, in the sea, and that is where carbon goes to die. That is where carbon is permanently stored. And whenever organic carbon is thrown into the ocean, it gets sequestered. It gets eaten, it gets consumed. You might get some seafood in the process, which case, you might, some of that might biologically be turned back into CO2. But the bulk of everything that goes, all the organic carbon that goes in the ocean that is organically consumable becomes mineralized. Now, there's one kind of carbon that does not lend itself well to mineralization, and that, of course, is CO2 itself. Because when CO2 finds itself in an aqueous solution, it's acidic, and it's not good. But that's not something that the ocean normally has to deal with. So the key to balancing the CO2 in the atmosphere of planet Earth is to put organic carbon into the ocean. Well, it doesn't really matter how you do that. As long as it's organic carbon, it's organically edible. But one of the best ways to do that is to have natural plants from mangrove species or other waterborne surface plants that are up in the air, pulling in CO2, getting good strong sunlight, and turning that into organic carbon. Because when a tree is planted in the water, its CO2, the organic carbon that it creates from the CO2 it absorbs, falls into the water. And in the aqueous solution and the marine environment, that carbon will become... So you say, well, how was it happening in the past? Well, rivers flowed into the sea, and all the trash, all the leaves, all the branches that ever fell into a river that washed out to sea became organic carbon and fed the fish and fed the life forms in the ocean and became eventually mineralized and became part of the ocean floor or the carbonate plateaus that we know of. So if this is in fact true, why don't we take all of our lawn clippings and all of our biological farm whatever and put it in the ocean? Well, if you did that, you'd not only make money because the number of fish that grow would increase and you'd have more seafood, you'd have crabs, and you'd have shrimp, and you have all the things you like to eat. But an even better idea is to go out and every 10 meters in the shallow ocean plant a rhizophora mango or some kind of a seawater plant of a mangrove typical species. Don't break a clump of them or a grove, because if you have a densely packed grove, the carbon will fall down and rot and go back into the atmosphere. You need trees over water. Their branches must drop the organic carbon into the sea, because when that carbon goes into the sea, it turns into seafood, other things, and eventually becomes mineral. And every hectare of mangrove forestation And the shallows of the ocean, where the organic carbon is going directly into the sea, will sequester 2 tons of organic carbon per hectare, with seagrasses and coral and things, and maybe even more. And this carbon will not hurt the ocean. The ocean will love it. The fish, our fish stocks will begin coming back, and the health of the ocean will be revived, and it will become filled with life. And the end of that carbon will be mineralized, gone in the ocean. This is the only solution. That's the only place where carbon goes to die. Everything else you've been told is fallacy, fantasy, hallucination, or deception. Because you can't show me the carbon underneath the rainforest. You can't show me the carbon under the forest. Everywhere there's trees, savanna, whatever, the carbon that you find underneath is a small, minuscule fraction. That's not where the carbon goes to die. Carbon goes into the ocean to die. And all we have to do is plant plants above the ocean, plants that fish are used to eating, that are natural to the environment, that will feed the organic ecosystem and liven up the ocean, clarify the water, make the lagoons clean and pure again so that the seagrasses can grow. And all of this, oxygenate the water, all this stuff is easily done. These plants want to grow everywhere as it is. All we have to do is create a little bit of physical structure to allow clumps of these mangroves to grow in the shallows, in the 40 million hectares of shallows around the world. And the organic carbon they produce will fall into the ocean, and it will not return to the atmosphere. And we can rebalance the atmosphere of Earth with 40 million hectares of marine shallows. We know where they are. I have them all mapped, and we can make the world a balanced ecosystem again.